The date is March 1971, and the location is the airspace high above the Sinai Peninsula, a rugged and sun-baked border between Israel and Egypt. The atmosphere is tense. The Six-Day War has ended, but the war of attrition continues in the shadows. On the radar screens of an Israeli early warning station, a contact appears that defies logic. It is flying at 65,000 feet in altitude, where the sky turns from a familiar blue to a hostile black space. But it is the speed that freezes the blood of the radar operator. The blip is moving at Mach 3.2. That is over 2,400 miles per hour. It is faster than a rifle bullet. It is faster than the rotation of the Earth at the equator. The Israeli Air Force scrambles its best interceptors, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantoms. These are powerful machines, the best the West has to offer, capable of Mach 2 and armed with the latest Sparrow missiles. The Israeli pilots push their throttles to the stops, dumping fuel into their afterburners, in a desperate attempt to climb and intercept. They fire their air-to-air missiles at the intruder, but it is futile. The laws of physics are against them. The missile's motor burns out, and it falls away unable to catch the ghost. The target simply accelerates and vanishes off the scope, leaving behind a sonic boom that shatters windows on the ground and a psychological shockwave that ripples all the way to Washington, D.C. The Israelis are stunned. The Americans are terrified. Intelligence analysts in the Pentagon look at the data and realize a horrifying truth. The Soviet Union has built a ghost, a machine that can fly higher and faster than anything in the West, a machine that seems to defy the limitations of known engineering. They call it the MiG-25. NATO codename Foxbat. For the next 5 years, this shadow would haunt the nightmares of the U.S. Air Force and the CIA. The MiG-25 became the boogeyman of the Cold War, the ultimate symbol of Soviet technological superiority. The CIA analysts looked at grainy reconnaissance photos of the jet sitting on Soviet runways, deep inside the Iron Curtain. They saw massive wings. They saw colossal engine intakes large enough to swallow a man whole. They saw a twin-tail design that looked aggressive, modern, and terrifying. Connecting the dots with a mixture of professional fear and Cold War paranoia, they constructed a profile of a superfighter. They believed the Foxbat was highly maneuverable, capable of dogfighting at supersonic speeds. They believed it was constructed of advanced lightweight titanium alloys to withstand the friction heat of Mach 3, which reaches over 300 degrees Celsius. They believed it possessed a look-down, shoot-down radar that could pick American bombers out of the background noise of the Earth from the edge of space. In the halls of Congress, generals testified with grim faces that the United States had lost air superiority. The Foxbat was cited as the reason to panic. It was the spur that drove the American military-industrial complex into a frenzy. They believed they were behind. They believed the Soviets had made a quantum leap in aeronautical engineering that the West could not match. They imagined fleets of these titanium monsters sweeping across Europe, untouchable by NATO defenses, obliterating the F-4 Phantoms, and clearing the skies for a Soviet invasion. The fear was palpable. It dictated budget strategy and the design of the next generation of American fighters. But in the closed, secret cities of the Soviet Union, the reality was very different. The designers at the Mikoyan Gurevich Bureau were not magicians. They were desperate men trying to solve an impossible problem with brute force. The MiG-25 was not a masterpiece of finesse. It was a masterpiece of compromise. It was not built to conquer the world. It was built out of fear, specifically fear of the American B-70 Valkyrie. In the late 1950s, the United States had begun developing a nuclear bomber capable of flying at Mach 3. The B-70 Valkyrie was designed to fly so high and so fast that no Soviet interceptor could touch it. The Kremlin was terrified. If the Americans built this bomber, Moscow could be incinerated before the Red Air Force could even launch a defense. The order went out to Mikoyan: build something that can stop it. build an interceptor that can reach 70,000 feet in minutes, and fire a missile at a target moving faster than a bullet. The Soviet engineers faced a crisis. They needed to fly at Mach 3, but they lacked the advanced materials to do it. At Mach 3, the air friction is so intense that aluminum frames soften and fail like wax. The Americans were building their spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, out of titanium to survive this heat. But titanium is incredibly expensive and difficult to work with. It requires welding in an argon gas atmosphere and precision tooling that the Soviet industry simply did not possess on a mass scale. So the Soviet engineers did something that Western analysts considered impossible. They built a Mach 3 aircraft out of steel, specifically a nickel-steel alloy, essentially the same heavy material used to make radiators and pipes. It was crude. It was heavy. It was brutal. To get this massive steel beast into the air, they needed engines of unimaginable power. They attached two Tumansky R-15 turbojets engines so massive, they were originally designed for disposable cruise missiles. These engines were not efficient. They were fuel-guzzling rockets that sucked down tons of kerosene in minutes. The superfighter the Americans feared was actually a flying brick. It was a triumph of thrust over aerodynamics. The massive wings that the CIA thought were for maneuverability were actually just there to generate enough lift to keep the heavy steel airframe from falling out of the sky. The huge intakes were needed to feed the insatiable hunger of the engines, and the engines themselves were suicidal. If the pilot pushed them past Mach 2.8, the turbines would overheat and literally melt, turning the engine into a piece of scrap metal. The Mach 3.2 flight over Israel that terrified the West resulted in destroyed engines. That pilot had violated the speed limit to escape. He glided back to landing, with his turbines fused solid. He was lucky to be alive, but the West did not know this. The Iron Curtain was effective. The illusion of the invincible Foxbat remained intact. The Soviet propaganda machine fueled the fire, parading the aircraft at air shows, zooming by in a blur of speed, hiding its crude construction behind a facade of power. The world believed the lie. Until September 6, 1976. On that overcast afternoon, the air traffic controllers at Hakodate Airport in northern Japan saw a blip appear on their radar. It was flying low just above the waves, trying to evade detection. It was not a civilian airliner. It was not an American jet. As the object approached the runway, observers on the ground gasped. It was the monster, the Foxbat. The pilot was a lieutenant named Viktor Belenko. He was not a spy. He was not a political activist. He was a man who was simply tired. He was tired of the lies. He was tired of the corruption. He was a pilot in the elite Soviet Air Defense Forces, stationed at Chuguyevka Air Base in the Far East. On paper, it was a frontline base protecting the motherland. In reality, it was a squalid, freezing prison. Belenko and his fellow pilots lived in barracks that were infested with rats. The heating often failed, leaving them to shiver in the Siberian winter. The food was barely edible, rotting vegetables and gristle. Morale was non-existent. Alcoholism was rampant. But the worst part was the aircraft itself. The MiG-25. The pilots knew the truth that the CIA did not. They knew their superfighter was a maintenance nightmare. It leaked hydraulic fluid. The electronics failed constantly. The radar was so powerful it was forbidden to turn it on the ground because it would kill anyone standing in front of it, but it was also crude and difficult to operate. Belenko had reached his breaking point. On a training sortie, he broke formation. He dove his MiG-25 down to treetop level to disappear from the Soviet ground control radar. He pushed the throttles forward, engaging the afterburners, feeling the raw vibration of the massive engines shaking the steel frame. He flew east toward Japan, toward freedom. The flight was harrowing. Belenko was flying blind. He had no maps of Japan. He was guessing. He dodged a Soviet interceptor sent to shoot him down. He evaded the Japanese phantoms sent to intercept him, by flying so low that he was almost skimming the water. When he finally saw the runway at Hakodate, he was running on fumes. He approached too fast. The MiG-25 is a heavy plane with a high landing speed. He touched down the tires, screeching smoke pouring from the brakes. He deployed the drag chute, but it wasn't enough. The massive steel fighter plowed off the end of the runway, tearing through antennas and fences, before finally coming to a halt in the grass just feet away from a busy road. Viktor Belenko climbed out of the cockpit. He fired a warning shot from his service pistol into the air, not to attack, but to keep the curious Japanese motorists away from his aircraft. He waited for the police. He had just stolen the most secret weapon in the Soviet arsenal and delivered it gift-wrapped to the West. When the news reached Washington, the reaction was electric. The CIA director could barely believe it. The ghost had landed. Intelligence teams were mobilized immediately. American aerospace engineers were flown to Japan in secret. They were finally going to touch the Foxbat. They expected to see the future. They prepared their tools to analyze advanced composites and microcircuitry. They expected to find the secrets of Mach 3 flight that had eluded them. What they found made them laugh. And then it made them gasp in disbelief. As they began to dismantle the aircraft, the myths evaporated one by one. They tapped the fuselage. It was not hollow ringing titanium. It was a dull thud. Steel. The plane was crudely welded by hand. There were rivet heads sticking out that were not even flush with the skin aerodynamic heresy in the West. "It is built like a tractor," one engineer remarked. It was agricultural engineering applied to aerospace. Then they opened the avionics bay. This was the moment of truth. They expected to find solid-state transistors and microchips, the kind of technology that guided the Apollo missions. Instead, they found vacuum tubes, the same glass bulbs used in 1950s radios. The engineers were stunned. "This is antique technology," they said. "How can this thing fly?" They laughed at the primitive nature of the radar, the Smerch A. It was a monster weighing half a ton, pumping out 600 kilowatts of power. It was designed to burn through jamming by sheer power rather than filter it out with intelligence. It was a brute force flashlight in a world of lasers. The Americans realized they had been afraid of a paper tiger. The huge wings were not for maneuverability, they were just there to keep the heavy steel airframe in the sky. The massive engines were not advanced. They were fuel-guzzling rockets that burned out after a few flights. The vacuum tubes were not there because the Soviets were stupid. They were there because they were resistant to the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, of a nuclear explosion. The MiG-25 was not a fighter. It was a manned missile designed for the apocalypse. The interrogation of Belenko confirmed their findings. He told them about the limitations of the aircraft. He told them he was forbidden to fly at Mach 3 because the engines would be destroyed. He told them he couldn't turn tight because the wings would snap off. He told them about the flying restaurant nickname because the radar used pure grain alcohol for cooling, which the crews would drink. The disassembly of the MiG-25 was methodical. The Americans took it apart piece by piece, analyzed every bolt, every wire, every drop of fuel. Then, in a final act of diplomatic humiliation, they packed the pieces into crates and shipped them back to the Soviet Union. They essentially returned a box of junk to the Kremlin. But the story did not end there. The panic of 1970 had a supreme irony. Because the Americans had been so terrified of the imaginary capabilities of the MiG-25, they had overcompensated. They had poured billions into creating a fighter that could beat the monster they thought existed. They demanded a plane that could fly fast, turn tight, carry advanced radar, and dominate the sky. The result was the F-15 Eagle. The F-15 was everything the MiG-25 was supposed to be, but wasn't. It was real. It was agile. It was high-tech. And when the F-15 finally met the MiG-25 in combat, years later, it was not a contest. It was an execution. The Soviet lie had birthed the American legend. The ghost had inadvertently created its own exorcist. The crates containing the dismantled remains of Viktor Belenko's MiG-25 arrived back in the Soviet Union like a coffin returning a body. The American engineers had been thorough. They had stripped the paint bored into the metal and analyzed the fuel residue. They had effectively performed an autopsy on the pride of the Soviet Air Force. When the Soviet technicians opened the boxes, they found a final insult. The Americans had kept the most sensitive components, including the Identify Friend or Foe system and the radar manuals. They had sent back only the heavy, useless steel carcass. To add injury to insult, the Japanese government sent Moscow a bill for $40,000 to cover the shipping costs and the damage Belenko had caused to the fence at Hakodate Airport. The Kremlin was furious, but they paid. They had no choice. The secret was out. The world knew that the emperor had no clothes and that the Foxbat was made of rust and vacuum tubes. But the true disaster for the Soviet Union was not the exposure of the MiG-25. It was the reaction to it. In the 5 years between the first radar sighting in 1971 and Belenko's defection in 1976, the United States Air Force had been driven by a singular paranoid vision. They believed they were facing a threat that was 10 feet tall. To defeat the imaginary superfighter they thought existed, they had poured unlimited funds into the F-15 Fawn Eagle program. They demanded that McDonnell Douglas build a plane that could accelerate vertically, that could turn on a dime, and that carried a radar computer powerful enough to track low-flying targets in the clutter. They over-engineered the F-15 to beat a ghost. When the truth was revealed, it was too late to stop the production lines. The United States had accidentally built the ultimate air superiority fighter. The F-15 Eagle was everything the MiG-25 was supposed to be, but wasn't. It was light. It was agile. It was made of titanium and composites. It had a kill ratio of 104-0. The supreme irony of the Cold War is that by trying to bluff the West with a scary-looking but primitive plane, the Soviet Union frightened the Americans into building the very weapon that would destroy the Soviet Air Force for the next 40 years. They had brought about their own doom through their own propaganda. While the engineers in Moscow scrambled to upgrade their compromised radar systems, Viktor Belenko was experiencing a different kind of shock in the United States. The CIA took him on a tour of America to help him acclimate. They took him to a supermarket in Virginia. Belenko thought it was a set. He believed the CIA had built a fake store filled with fake food just to impress him. He looked at the shelves stocked with dozens of types of cereal, fresh meat, and vegetables that didn't require a ration card. He fell to his knees. He realized that everything he had been told about the West was a lie. The prosperity he saw was not propaganda, it was reality. This psychological collapse of a Soviet officer was perhaps as damaging as the technical loss. It proved that the Soviet system could not provide for its own elite, let alone its people. Back in the Soviet Union, the MiG-25 continued to serve, but its reputation was shattered. It became known among Western pilots not as a predator, but as a target. In the Soviet Union, it earned a different nickname. The pilots called it the Flying Restaurant. This was because the massive primitive radar required hundreds of liters of pure grain alcohol for cooling. On remote frozen airbases, desperate mechanics and pilots would drain the cooling system to drink the alcohol. It was a grim metaphor for the late Soviet era, a warplane that was essentially a flying vodka bottle manned by demoralized conscripts. The combat record of the MiG-25 proved the American engineers right. In the 1980s, during the Lebanon War, the Israeli Air Force faced off against the Syrian Air Force, which was equipped with the MiG-25. The Soviet advisors assured the Syrians that their speed would save them. But the Israelis flying the American-made F-15 Eagles used tactics instead of brute force. They baited the Foxbats into turning. Once the heavy steel MiG-25 started to turn, it bled speed rapidly. It became a sitting duck. The Israeli F-15s slaughtered them. They shot them down with Sparrow missiles. They shot them down with sidewinders. The invincible high-altitude interceptor was falling from the sky in burning pieces across the Bekaa Valley. In Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the MiG-25 managed its only significant success. On the first night of the war, an Iraqi Foxbat, piloted by Lieutenant Zuhair Dawood, managed to shoot down an American F-18 Hornet, piloted by Scott Spiker. It was the only air-to-air kill the Iraqi Air Force achieved in the entire war. But it was a fluke, a lucky shot in the dark against an overloaded pilot who was distracted by surface-to-air missiles. For the rest of the war, the MiG-25s were hunted down relentlessly. American F-15 pilots described engagements where the Iraqi Foxbats would take off, accelerate to Mach 2, and simply run away to Iran, refusing to fight. The great white hope of Soviet aviation had been reduced to a fugitive running for the border. The Soviets tried to fix the mistakes. They eventually developed the MiG-31 Foxhound, a modernized version of the Foxbat that actually had a good radar and a second crewman to operate it. The MiG-31 was a formidable machine, but it was too expensive and came too late to save the empire. The economic rot caused by trying to match American technology with brute force had already eaten away the foundations of the state. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of an invasion, but because it bankrupted itself, building weapons it couldn't afford to fight enemies it couldn't see. Today, the rusting hulks of MiG-25s can be found in museums and boneyards across the former Soviet bloc. They sit on flat tires, their steel skins corroded by the rain, massive engines silent. They are monuments to a specific kind of hubris. The Soviet Union believed that they could conquer physics with ideology. They believed that if they made something big enough and loud enough, the world would bow down in fear. They forgot that in the game of high-stakes, technological poker, you eventually have to show your hand. When Viktor Belenko climbed out of his cockpit in Japan, he didn't just defect from a country. He defected from a lie. He exposed the reality that the Soviet superpower was a hollow shell painted in scary colors. The MiG-25 Foxbat remains one of the most fascinating machines ever built, not because of what it could do, but because of what the world imagined it could do. It was the plane that won the psychological war, but lost the real one. And somewhere in a hangar in the United States, the engineers who took it apart are still smiling, knowing that the rust on their gloves was the first sign of the Iron Curtain crumbling down. The legacy of the Foxbat is not in the skies. It is in the history books, a reminder that fear is often a reflection of our own imagination, and that sometimes the monster in the closet is just a pile of old rusty steel. The humiliation of the MiG-25 did not end with the Cold War. History saved one final surreal chapter for the Foxbat, a chapter that would perfectly symbolize the futility of the Soviet doctrine. The year is 2003. The location is Al-Taqaddum Air Base in the dusty heat of occupied Iraq. American troops searching the perimeter of the captured airfield noticed something strange. The tails of aircraft were sticking out of the sand dunes, not like crashed planes, but like deliberate monuments. When they brought in the excavators and began to dig, they uncovered a sight that stunned the world. Buried deep beneath tons of sand wrapped in plastic sheeting and preservative grease were dozens of MiG-25 Foxbats. The Iraqi Air Force, terrified of the American air dominance they had faced in 1991, had decided that the only way to save their most powerful fighters was to bury them like pirate treasure. They knew that if they flew them, the F-15 Eagles would shoot them down instantly. They knew that if they left them in hangars, the B-2 Spirits would bomb them. So the Mach 3 interceptor, the plane designed to touch the edge of space, ended its career as a fossil buried in the dirt. When the American soldiers dragged the massive steel carcasses out of the sand, the irony was palpable. The wings were removed to fit them in the holes. The engines were clogged with grit. The radar dishes were crushed. These were the same machines that had caused a panic in the Pentagon 30 years earlier. Now they were nothing more than dinosaurs dug up by archaeologists. the Americans didn't even bother to study them this time. They had already learned everything they needed to know from Belenko. They simply cut them up for scrap or sent a few home as museum curiosities. The ghost had become a souvenir, but the DNA of the Foxbat did not die completely. The Soviet engineers realized that while the execution of the MiG-25 was flawed, the concept of a super-fast interceptor was still valid. They took the rusty, heavy airframe of the Foxbat and filled it with legitimate modern technology. The result was the MiG-31 Foxhound. Unlike its predecessor, the Foxhound was not a bluff. It had a second crew member to operate the radar, solving the pilot workload issue. It had the Zaslon radar, the first passive electronically scanned array ever fitted to a fighter, which could actually look down and shoot down cruise missiles. The MiG-31 was what the MiG-25 claimed to be, but it arrived too late. It entered service just as the Soviet economy was entering its death spiral. The cost of building and maintaining these titanium and steel monsters was exorbitant. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the MiG-31 fleet was largely grounded. The pilots couldn't get paid. The complex radars couldn't be serviced. The ultimate interceptor sat on snowy runways, protecting a country that no longer existed against an enemy that was no longer attacking. And what of Viktor Belenko, the man who started it all? His life in America became the ultimate testament to the difference between the two systems. He did not just disappear into witness protection. He became a consultant for the U.S. Air Force. He stood in lecture halls in front of American fighter pilots, men who had spent their careers training to kill him, and taught them how the Soviet mind worked. He explained the rigid top-down command structure that paralyzed Soviet pilots. He explained why they relied so heavily on ground control. He helped the Americans refine their tactics to exploit these weaknesses. Belenko married an American woman. He had children. He worked as an aerospace engineer. He embraced the freedom he had risked his life to find. In interviews, he often spoke about his first visit to an American supermarket, which he called the most shocking moment of his life. He said that the sheer variety of cat food in a U.S. grocery store was better than the food available to a Soviet colonel. This simple observation cut deeper than any satellite photo. It revealed that the Soviet Union was a superpower that could build Mach 3 jets, but couldn't feed its own people. It was a military with a hollow center. The legacy of the MiG-25 Foxbat is complex. To the casual observer, it is just a big, fast plane. But to the historian, it is a physical manifestation of the Soviet Union itself. It was big. It was powerful. It was terrifying from a distance. But up close it was crude, heavy, and held together by brute force and vodka. It relied on the fear of the unknown. Once that fear was removed, once the panel was unscrewed and the vacuum tubes were exposed, the power evaporated. The Americans won the air war of the Cold War, not just because they had better technology, but because they had a better philosophy. They built planes like the F-15 and F-16 that were flexible, reliable, and designed for the pilot. The Soviets built planes like the MiG-25 that were designed for a specific mathematical scenario that never happened. They prepared for World War III with a sledgehammer, while the Americans prepared with a scalpel. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a MiG-25. It sits quietly in the hangar. It is dark and menacing. It still looks fast even when standing still. But next to it is the F-15 Eagle. The Eagle is sleek, agile, and undefeated. The juxtaposition tells the whole story. One is a monument to a lie that panicked the world. The other is the weapon that the lie created, and the weapon that ultimately ensured the lie would never fly again. The generals who were terrified in 1970 eventually retired. The spies moved on to new targets. But the lesson of the Foxbat remains. In the arms race, perception is often more dangerous than reality. The U.S. Air Force built a real monster to fight a fake one, and in doing so, they secured the skies for generations. The rust on Belenko's plane was not just corrosion. It was the truth breaking through the paint.